Hello, comrades. We'll be starting in just a few minutes. If you want, put your name and pronouns and branch in the chat if you're on Zoom. We'll be starting in just a couple minutes, comrades. If you want, you can put your name, pronouns, and branch in the chat if you're on Zoom. Okay, comrades, I think we're ready to get started. Welcome, comrades and friends, to Workers' World Party's weekly broadcast, where hundreds of revolutionaries from across the globe gather to strategize, to analyze, and to build the struggle for a socialist future, a workers' world. Tonight, we have an exciting panel of comrades from Workers' World Party who will be taking on the question, what should workers expect from a Biden administration? I am your host, Ezra Echo of Workers' World Party in Buffalo, a young non-binary lesbian who uses the pronouns they, them, and z here. And I'm coming to you right from a demo in Buffalo that the branch called Demanding No Honeymoon for Biden, Smash Imperialism and White Supremacy. It was a really good demo. We probably had about 35 people come out, which, considering it's below freezing here, is pretty good. No one really wants to go outside when it's so cold, especially for a protest. But we had a lot of really inspirational speakers I spoke about some things we might expect as far as LGBTQ plus rights. One of my other comrades spoke about the blockade against Cuba and the impact that has had and how we need to end the blockade. And other people in the community spoke about things like police brutality and prisons. And overall, it was a very revolutionary protest. So tonight, we're going to be dedicating our program to a dearly loved Workers' World comrade, Ruben Kanowitz, who passed away last night. Ruben and Joyce Kanowitz joined Workers' World Party more than 55 years ago. Through every struggle over the decades, Ruben and Joyce were there. Both Ruben and Joyce were taken to the hospital with COVID-19 virus last week. Joyce is now at home recovering. We will say so much about Ruben in the weeks ahead. Ruben Kanowitz Presente. Before we get started, please make sure to share the live stream on video on Facebook, Twitter, and wherever you can post on social media so that we can further reach our class with this powerful conversation. I want to remind you all that while most people are watching on Zoom, if you could take a second to go to Workers' World Party's Facebook page, facebook.com/Workers World Party, and share this live video with your friends and in your Facebook groups and pages. That would help us enormously to reach more members of our class. Also, we encourage you to share your comments at Workers World on Twitter. We are also live on YouTube tonight for all of you YouTubers. For all of you on Zoom, you can add your pronouns and city so that we can refer to you correctly when you ask questions or type in the chat. Yesterday, Joe Biden was sworn into the imperial presidency in what many in the bourgeois media are calling a return to normalcy. Whatever is normal about a country founded on genocide, slavery, exploitation, and war. Many progressives are cheering Joe Biden's victory. We in Workers' World Party realized that the defeat of Trump was much less about Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, and much more about the working class movements, which have been fighting racism, police brutality, sexism, COVID-19, capitalism, and all of the white supremacist, imperialist policies of the Trump regime. For our allies who are celebrating, we would like for you to take a clear assessment of Joe Biden's past, as well as his current plans, so that we can get a clearer picture of the terrain on which we are fighting capitalism. Biden has 17 immediate executive actions which are meant to please his base into giving him a chance or to go back to brunch. He is moving to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. He signed an executive order to rescind Keystone XL pipeline permit. He's temporarily halting oil and gas leasing in Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. These are huge victories for the millions of young people and others who marched for climate justice. Yet Biden, who is allied with the DuPont family, is not willing to even say the words Green New Deal, a plan which provides for significant reforms to avoid some of the worst impacts of the climate crisis. On the pandemic, he is putting forth a 100-day mask challenge. He is rejoining the World Health Organization. He is asking the CDC to immediately extend eviction restrictions temporarily. Yet he is not calling for rents or back payments on mortgages to be canceled. He is not for universal health care. Reversing Trump's travel ban on several Muslim-majority countries. Yet he won't admit that he was one of the architects of the wars on Iraq or Syria, which led to so many migrants fleeing their homelands. You may be saying, Ezra, give the guy a break. It's only his first day. He is doing so much better than Trump. But we cannot give him a break. And that's what our panel is about tonight. So our panelists for tonight are Larry Holmes, Workers' World Party's first secretary, who uses he, him pronouns. Sarah Flounders, Workers' World Party in New York City, co-director of the International Action Center, who uses she, her pronouns. Olujimi Alade, WWP Philadelphia, who uses he, him pronouns. We have Judy Greenspan in the Bay Area of Workers' World Party, who uses they, them pronouns, and Nate Chase in New York City, who uses he, him pronouns. So our first question of tonight is for Larry to start with, and all the other comrades are encouraged to give their 2 cents once Larry is done. What does the Biden what does Biden mean for the working class, and how should we respond? Go ahead, Larry.
Yeah, just welcome to all the comrades and friends who are able to join us this evening. It's an important question, comrade. Biden is coming in the midst of the biggest crisis of world capitalism and U.S. capitalism since the Great Depression. So there are a lot of interesting and complicated things going on, but we should be careful, if we begin to forget which side of the class barricade that the new president is on. Biden's essentially a right-wing racist politician, historically close ties to the Jim Crow segregationists, responsible for the mass incarceration of the early 90s that we're still fighting against. But because of the crisis, people like Janet Yellen, who's his new Treasury Secretary and was formerly the head of the Federal Reserve, have apparently gotten his ear and told him, the capitalist economy is in real bad shape, worse than 2009. And you better spend some money, or at least push spending money. And that's behind the nearly $2 trillion COVID relief program that Biden announced about a week ago. And as my comrade just mentioned, Biden's issued a fair number of quote unquote progressive executive orders. I guess this is like paying some pennies off to progressives so he doesn't have to pay off dollars later. He's sounding a little better on Trump's war against migrant workers, but is it really? Not so if you really investigate it. And of course, none of this as of yet is a real response to the needs of millions of workers and oppressed people in this country who are in dire need. At the end of the day, Biden's a tried and trusted servant of capitalism. And if he's going to do anything significant in a helpful way for the workers, he's going to have to be forced to in the old-fashioned way, and that is through militant class struggle. It poses some big questions for the left. Here are two of them. How much of the left is going to be pulled in and absorbed by Biden and the Democrats? Or is it going to fight for independence from Biden, from the Democrats, and from the capitalist system? And I think an equally important strategic question is a large section, hopefully, of the left, the anti-capitalist left, the anti-white supremacist left, the anti-fascist left, going to turn toward the strategy that is really meaningful, and that is organizing the working class. In this respect, I think the Black Lives Matter movement could be strategic. This is a powerful movement. It's not necessarily heterogeneous, but it's the only movement at the moment that's able to shut down a country, to bring about the closest thing to social revolution, which it did over the past 7 or 8 months after the massacre of George Floyd. Can that energy of BLM, can that militancy be turned toward organizing workers? This is deeply anti-racist. It's Black and brown workers who have suffered the most under the pandemic. Last month, I'm talking about December, 100%, more than 100% actually, statistically, of those who filed for unemployment were Black and brown women. This underscores not only the misogynist, but the racist character of who suffered under the pandemic. If BLM can direct the fury and the anger, for example, into a struggle for justice for Black and brown women, workers, wouldn't this be a tremendous thing? And also into supporting migrant workers who are suffering in so many ways, on so many levels, and who are not even eligible if they have no documents for many of the benefits that few workers actually end up getting. Let me conclude by just telling you about a big struggle that I think is going to be important under the early days of this capitalist Biden administration. There's a big worker struggle brewing against Amazon. Amazon is synonymous with capitalism. It's just about the biggest capitalist multinational corporation with operations all over the world. Its president, Jeff Bezos, is the richest individual in the world, and it's racist to the core. If you don't take my word, you can ask Chris Smalls, one of the militant leaders of Amazon workers who used to work at an Amazon warehouse in Staten Island, in a small town called Bessemer, Alabama, which is just outside of Birmingham. Amazon has a warehouse which employs about 6,000 workers. Most of them are Black workers. They are organizing a union. They will be voting for union representation starting in a few weeks through the end of March. If they succeed, the door will be kicked down for the organization of the close to 900,000 Amazon workers nationwide. I think most of the Amazon workers who are outside of the United States are already organized to one extent or another. And of course, this doesn't even count Whole Foods, which has a significant workforce, which is owned by Amazon. If this happens, comrades and friends, this will be a big blow to US capitalism. There are Amazon and Whole Food outlets everywhere. That makes it relatively easy for those of us who want to solidarize ourselves with the Amazon and Whole Foods workers organizing themselves, many locations in every city and town to have solidarity demonstrations at. Imagine if we had demonstrations around the same time in 100 different locations around the country, either at Amazon or Whole Foods, or maybe several hundred, as many as we can. Demonstrations warning Jeff Bezos that if you fight the workers' drive to unionize, we will shut you down. This is the kind of worker solidarity that the future struggle needs. And I hope comrades and friends and allies underscore this in high on the things that need to be done under this new capitalist Biden administration.
Thank you, Larry. Does anyone else want to speak about this question? If not, we can just move on to the next one. Over the summer, we saw the birth of the largest working class social movement in the history of the US, the Black Lives Matter uprising. Many supporters of this movement voted for Biden, yet Biden has a long racist history, including writing the 1994 crime bill, helping develop the war on drugs, and opposing school integration in the 1970s. How would a Biden presidency change the conditions that led to the murder of black and brown people by the police, as well as millions of incarcerated workers facing COVID-19 behind the walls? Judy, can you talk to us about Joe Biden's legacy in beginning the mass incarceration movement in this country, and also a bit about Kamala Harris's history as an SF prosecutor and the state attorney general? What needs to happen now to save the lives of our incarcerated siblings?
I guess unmuting is a good thing to do on a webinar. Thank you so much for the question. You know, it's actually been a very painful time for those of us who are involved in supporting incarcerated workers. And people behind the walls are incarcerated workers, and they're part of our working class, and they're part of our fight back. They were part of our fight back against Trump, and they will be part of our fight back against the Biden administration and the capitalist system right now. But we just witnessed, because the legacy, Trump's legacy, or basically his farewell, his FU to the working class and to people behind the walls, was to resurrect the federal death penalty and to murder 13 people in a very short period of time. Now, we can say, and everyone said, oh, this is horrible, this is the Republicans, and The Democrats would never do that. Well, that's not really true, because the Democrats have used the death penalty. And in fact, only after Trump murdered 13 people and resurrected the federal death penalty did someone, a member of the squad, Ayanna Pressley, Representative Ayanna Pressley, finally proposed a legislation to outlaw the death penalty. But the death penalty has been with us for decades under Democrat. It is a bipartisan measure used to terrorize incarcerated workers and to terrorize really overall the working class. And there's a very serious situation right now, and I am going to get into Biden's legacy, but right now in the prisons, there is a very large number, there's a disproportionate number of incarcerated people who are dying from COVID. In California, every time we turn around, it's now almost 200 prisoners have died from COVID behind the walls. And in some prisons, over a quarter of the prison population, one prison now, over half of the prison population are infected with COVID. Biden, unfortunately, is not going to be the president who signs an executive order ordering states and the federal government to do mass releases. And this has been the outcry from families, but I don't think we're going to get that relief from Biden. I don't think we're going to get that relief from Kamala Harris. President Biden is the man who is responsible for the growth of the prison industrial complex. He is responsible. He authored the laws that put hundreds of thousands of poor Black and brown people in prison. And oftentimes when he was authoring these laws, and this was during Bush, it was during Clinton, it doesn't matter who was president, he would always say he felt that he would write a law that was even more stringent than what President Bush, what the Republicans would propose. And he was one of the loudest cheerleaders who demanded, who set up the disparity of sentencing between crack and powder cocaine and filled the prisons, really literally filled the prisons. He also authored legislation that poured billions of dollars into the building of prisons. So James Baldwin had a very important quote that I think about all the time. I can't believe what you say because I see what you do. And so because of the incredible power of the Black liberation, of the Black Lives Matter movement and the Black struggle and the struggle against police terror and police lynchings, the Democrats have had to sort of soft pedal. And now, even Biden is talking, Kamala Harris has been talking a little more. Kamala Harris, by the way, was actually infamous for not speaking out against the early murders of young Black people in California. Kamala Harris is sort of affectionately known as the super cop, because she started out as a prosecutor, and a lot of her early, she didn't have a totally horrendous record. She opposed the use of 3 strikes law to send people to prison for, quote, the third strike being a nonviolent crime. She, at one point, opposed the death penalty against a young man who had killed a cop, or a young Latinx man who had killed a cop. But as a prosecutor, she also had to prosecute people, and she had to give them the death penalty. So it was a pretty, and also after a prosecutor, then she became state attorney general, and as state attorney general, she refused to release prisoners who even were championed by the Innocence Project. So there have been, you have somebody who wrote the crime bills, filled the prisons, and then you have somebody who is a super prosecutor. So I will tell you, the prison abolitionist movement, incarcerated workers, we're very worried about what this means in terms of justice for incarcerated workers. We don't think, we think that we're going to have to redouble our efforts to fight for mass releases. And I'll say the same, there's a parallel between the corporations that built the prisons and the corporations that are now managing the ICE detention centers. And there's a very serious criminal organization called Geo Group, which owns private prisons around the country and halfway houses, which are semi-lockdown units, and also some of the worst, with the heaviest violations of human rights abuses in California, and of course around the U.S. But so we are definitely, this is not going to be something that we're going to be able to say, oh, well, he's going to do really well on this, and he's supposedly coming up with a criminal justice plan and all this stuff. But we're going to have to be, of course, we're for abolishing the prisons, but we're definitely going to have to be demanding that big changes happen as we go forward.
Thank you, Judy. Does anyone else want to add on to that or speak about this question? All right, well, we'll just move on then. So before we get to our next questions, we have a few announcements. If you like what you're hearing and you're interested in joining a revolutionary Marxist-Leninist party that fights in the belly of the beast, then you can check out workers.org/join. Fill out the join form there, and an organizer will be in touch with you as soon as possible. We also have a new book that just came out. Many writers for Workers' World newspaper, as well as Ajamu Barak, Mumia Abu Jamal, Vivek Prashad, Margaret Kimberly, Max Blumenthal, Lee Suhin, and Kevin Zies have contributed to a new book, Capitalism on a Ventilator: The Impact of COVID-19 in China and the US. And this book is available for purchase. So, our next question is, Biden was an architect for Plan Colombia, which internationalized the war on drugs, resulting in the deaths of thousands of civilians, the displacement of over 1 million people, and the destruction of large swaths of food crops. Biden voted for the disastrous Iraq war, a war that cost over $3 trillion, killed over 1 million Iraqis, displaced over 3 million people, and injured millions more. Years later, Biden said he would do it again. Now Biden is proposing a whole set of warmongers to join his cabinet. Sarah, can you tell us, how does the Biden administration plan to change the plans of U.S. imperialism and the workers and oppressed all over the world fighting against it?
Well, thanks, Ezra. And this is a big question. But let me open by saying, along with saying Ruben Kanowitz Presente, our dearly loved Ruben Kanowitz, who died yesterday of COVID. And this is part of the crime that is going on. More than 400,000 deaths in the US, the highest in the world. That's the crime. And Biden, can he really change this? It was so encouraging to take part yesterday in Inauguration Day in a workers' assembly against racism, because the theme was, we're making demands on the Biden administration from day one. Now, it's not only us here who are asking, what can working people expect? But in countries around the world, every country is asking, what can we expect from the US empire? What can we expect from this new administration? Now, Biden's plans this week certainly sound glowing in comparison to Trump. But we just have to keep a hold and remember that Biden is promising no substantial change. And substantial systemic change is what we need desperately here at home in the midst of the worst crisis, economic, health crisis. Now, I know so many people think this is a really difficult time because so many people think that anything is better than what we had with Trump. But as Larry said, this is a fundamental question. What side of the barricade is Biden on? So Biden's support for the bombing and the destruction, the occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan his writing of the Plan Colombia, you know, as he said on Iraq, he supported it then and he'd do it again. He would do it again. So if you hear the congressional hearings on Biden's appointments, it's so revealing. It is a diverse cabinet, yes, and that's not an insignificant change. But no substantial change really means continuing US endless war. So I think we have to look at what this is going to mean for us. It's the center of a brutal world empire that is built on slavery and genocide. And US corporate power is more than willing, and has through its entire history, to loot the world at any cost to save their position. But this is today an empire in decline. And even with gruesome sanctions on a third of the world, 39 countries, even with wars, endless wars on one side of the world to the other, even with 800 military bases, they can't reverse their own decline. This is the crisis. There's complete decay, a dying system, and Biden can't reverse that for them. So what does that mean that they might do? It's a big threat, it's a big risk, and every country is asking. What will imperialist politicians with a giant military machine do to save a dying system? We see it here: racist police murders, the prison system, the wars here at home, the sickness and disease and the virus they can't handle. And we also can see it in countries around the world, racist US wars all over the world. Now, Biden's plan is to strengthen the alliances with junior imperialist partners. Yes, he'll go back to the Paris Accords on the environment. He wants to have agreements. He wants to act in a different way than Trump. Yes. But look at his Secretary of State and the hearings that just happened in Congress, 5 hours. Anthony Blinken's hearings for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. What did Blinken say? Support for the war in Syria, and said the US isn't doing enough. They want to go back in stronger. That's pretty dangerous. They want, and I'm quoting, unrelenting pressure on North Korea, even stricter sanctions, cutting off of all resources. Blinken wants more missiles to Asia to scare China into pressuring North Korea. They want really a league of what they're calling democracies. This means other imperialist allies, to isolate China. Now, will this happen? Can they accomplish all this? The interesting thing is this had a huge support in both Republicans and Democrats. They praised this as a very reasonable bipartisan plan. And this shows it's not just the Biden administration, it is both imperialist parties. They're willing to take a new approach as long as it's continuing the encirclement of China, challenging China in the South China Sea, which is like selling aircraft carriers into the Gulf of Mexico. If China were to do that, imagine. So they want to sharpen the threats on Iran and try to get the European allies to raise new, harsher demands on Iran. That's what Biden means when he says, oh yeah, we'll go back to the plan, the 5-for-1 agreement with Iran, but with new, harsher agreements that were never in the accords. With Israel, it's a total Zionist policy, and including no intention to move the US embassy out of Jerusalem, which was a complete violation of UN resolutions and international conventions. There's a whole expression of support for Juan Guaido, who holds no position in Venezuela, but he has US support. Actually invited to the inauguration was Carlos Vecchio, who represents Guaido in DC. And Part of the congressional hearings yesterday was how to more effectively target Venezuelan sanctions. So, you could go on with looking at so many of the cabinet positions, looking at Biden's history. It can be terrifying. And it's one more reason to say we need a people's movement here that is linking these wars. Look at Victoria Nuland, who's just named the Undersecretary of State. Really good example. Nuland she bragged that $5 billion was spent to engineer the US coup in the Ukraine in 2014, to bring the US commanded NATO military alliance right to the borders of Russia. It led to a civil war in the Ukraine. And it was really a financed fascist coup. Nuland had a big role in that, and she's considered quite an expert on the strengthening of NATO. So it immediately signals that relations with Russia and China will get worse and that the NATO military alliance will be reinforced. Military spending is already more than the rest of the world combined, and it's going to increase. This National Endowment for the Democracy, which is money for subversion and coups, will increase. So all of this, we can see a criminal policy, the sanctions, which means starving down countries, denying trade and resources and medical supplies, even food, that's going to be intensified. It is not a very good picture. And I just want to end this little piece by saying that US wars come home. It's not without reason. It's these endless wars that there's a highest rate of COVID infection right here in the US than anywhere in the world. 400,000 deaths. More than 25 million people infected. And yet the most fabulously expensive technology of military infrastructure, the largest police force in the world, the largest prison system in the world, and no plans, I don't see it anywhere in anything Biden has promised, to build a social or medical infrastructure. No plan of Medicare for all. So the US wars come home. The refusal to give cooperation and aid, vaccine aid to countries around the world, while China is giving billions and billions of shots. These crises will pay a terrible price because this is an empire in decline, and capitalism needs division, it needs racism, it needs bigotry to keep the working class here divided, and it needs war, crisis, confrontation, hunger, shortages to confront countries around the world. And this is a challenge that we face, really always linking these struggles and standing in solidarity with countries that are just trying to survive the US empire.
Thank you, Sarah. Those were some great points. And I think Joe Biden's really showed us who he is. Like you said, he would do it again. Exactly. So that's exactly what we can expect from him at this point. More imperialist war, more suffering inflicted by the imperialist nation that we are. Does anyone else want to speak on this question at all?
I could just say a few words.
Yes, please do.
Yeah, I mean, I think so-called foreign policy is where the consensus of the two parties is most clear. They make the least effort to distinguish themselves. And I think it's also worth noting Biden's long history of support for the Zionist project and the genocide of the Palestinian people, going so far as to say that if Israel did not exist, we would have to invent it for the benefit of U.S. interests, which says everything. Well, maybe it was invented for the benefit of U.S. interests. And so I think it's worthwhile to point out both that and also the way China was raised during the campaign, how both Trump and Biden worked to outdo each other, to be more aggressive on China. We see this also with the DPRK, how when there were some brief and altogether not terribly serious attempts by the US to de-escalate tensions with the DPRK, meaning North Korea, the Democratic Party actually went to the right of the Republicans to insist that pressure, military and economic, against the DPRK be intensified. So I think of all issues, the question of continuing imperialist war is the one in which the unanimity of the two working class parties is the clearest. And they're as Larry and Sarah raised, which side of the barricade they're on is so clearly exposed. Thanks.
Great
So-
point, Nick.
I'd just like to add something real quick, if that's okay.
Please do, Judy.
A very important tenet of Workers' World Party is international solidarity and internet and support for struggles that are happening around the world. And the movement, a lot of times we've had to try to convince the movement to support different struggles, sometimes successfully, sometimes not successfully, based on how much certain struggles were demonized. And I'm very worried about Venezuela. I'm very worried about, I'm worried about Syria. I'm worried about the struggles where there's a lot of confusion in terms of supporting them. And I just want to, yesterday we had a rally in San Francisco against racism and fascism on Inauguration Day. And we had a lot of speakers. And one of the speakers who came was Rhonda Romero, who is the head of Bayan. And Bayan has been exemplary in their, first of all, fighting. They know what it is to fight fascism, because they're fighting the fascism of the Duterte government, which has been, which was put in place by the US government and supported all through this time. But that we have to be the strongest internationalists at this time and extend our solidarity to all people who are struggling against US imperialism, which is now the face of it is the Biden administration, because I think, as Nate said, we're going to have some very serious struggles ahead.
We definitely are. And anyone else want to say anything before we move on?
Yeah, just underscoring, sort of the main highlights of what the other comrades have said. Trump's strategy, to a large extent, in response to the world capitalist crisis, which is getting worse as we speak, was to break off, the alliance between the main imperialist countries and let's just go into a, dog eat dog, competition mode. Clearly, the Biden administration wants to reverse that and try to repair those relationships with the other big imperialists and strengthen its colonial imperialist empire over the peoples of the developing countries, be it in Latinx America or Africa or the Middle East or Asia. To understand this is to understand the utter and urgent necessity for the growth of genuine internationalist forces. A symptom of that internationalism, an important symptom of it, is our stand in connection with those who face colonial, neo-colonial oppression and occupation, like the Palestinian people, like most of the peoples of the Middle East to one extent or another, like the peoples of Africa, the peoples of Latinx America. But that is part of a larger need on our part, and that's to see ourselves as part of a world class of the workers and the oppressed that transcends borders, geography, cultures, and languages. And so much damage has been done to that unity, but a lot of work if we are willing to invest it as revolutionaries, can undo that damage, because that moving historically in the direction of seeing the world as a struggle between two big classes is really where history is moving, and the final struggle against capitalism is moving in. And we need to be the leaders of that movement, and not ignoring it or tailing it.
Thank you, Larry. Does anyone else want to speak before we move on? Joe Biden has released his $1.9 trillion plan to fight COVID. What is in this plan? What is missing from this plan to really defeat the pandemic? Is it significant that Medicare for All is not a part of this plan? Jimmy, as a worker in the healthcare industry, what do you think this all means?
Well, as a worker in the healthcare industry, I see the ravages of the American healthcare system every single day. It pains me to witness elderly people having to pay hundreds of dollars to get basic treatments. It angers me to witness families cry on the phone because their loved ones are getting discharged earlier than they should because health insurance wouldn't pay their fair share. And it scares me to know that millions of Americans are unable to get the necessary vaccinations to protect themselves from this ravaging disease. A disease that even young, active, and healthy people can suffer from. And with the virus as contagious as ever before, a more immediate, instant response is necessary, something that Medicare for All can provide. A universal healthcare system would not only give the working class peace of mind, but it has been proven to be the biggest deterrent to the spread of COVID-19. Look at Cuba, look at Vietnam, even look at the so-called evil empire, China. What's even more pathetic is that Medicare for All isn't even a radical position. If a country governed by a milquetoast center-right colonist can have free healthcare, then what is stopping Biden and the intersectional gang? That's right, sticking it to the Bernie bros, while the proletariat will be the ones paying the price for the Biden administration's immaturity. In addition, his proposal for $15 an hour as a minimum wage is too little, too late. If you have even a basic knowledge of Das Kapital, productivity has far outpaced wages. In fact, if the minimum wage were to catch up to productivity, wages would be at least $25 and $27 an hour. $15 an hour isn't even a sustainable wage in places like New York City and the Bay Area. And to add insult to injury, Biden has even issued an executive order to cancel student debt. Even Warren's $50,000 proposal was more substantial. But Biden is willing to wipe out $10,000 off of the ledgers. I'm not sure if Biden got the memo, but the average student debt is $32,000. Many economists even stated that canceling student debt would boost the economy immensely by increasing cash flow. If Biden, Harris, and company were really interested in bringing America back, this would be a nice step in the right direction. But as we all know, that's the point. The United States of America never truly left. It has always been interested in one thing and one thing only: getting rich at the expense of the poor, marginalized, and oppressed.
Thank you, Jimmy. And I think, as we'll see, it is very significant that Medicare for All is not included in this plan, especially because it's the most marginalized and the most poor people who don't have health care still and who have trouble paying for things. And as I was just talking about earlier, it's very significant for the LGBTQ plus community because many of us are very used to receiving, if any medical care at all, very careless and not well thought out medical care. I just had to scare myself where my testosterone was way too high in those numbers. It can be a really dangerous place to be in, and it's all because of the negligence of doctors. And if we demanded for not just healthcare for all, but for funding to be put into more AIDS research and more research on the effects of HRT and more research on advancing gender confirming surgeries for trans people. Those are all things that we need to be doing. And yet they're not even trying to push for Medicare for all to help defeat COVID. Does anyone else want to speak on this?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Jimmy, such a good point. And when you think of Medicare for all and other Biden appointees, I want to raise the governor of Rhode Island, Gina Raimondo. She's also the former treasurer of the state. She's going to lead the Commerce Department. Now, this is really important department, has a lot to do with this $1.9 trillion program that we're supposed to be getting. What was Gina Raimondo before she was a treasurer and then the governor? She was an entrepreneur, a hedge fund investor, totally pro-business, anti-working class, and notorious among venture capitalists, who are capitalists who sort of swoop in and grab up companies and milk them. It's highly speculative. It's all high risk. So when she became treasurer, she looted the state pension fund in the most amazing way, and literally pulling out millions and millions of dollars that went to the hedge funds. And the pension fund suffered something like a $2 billion hit. The benefits were cut. So, you can see, and then as governor, actually cut the amount of money to Medicaid while giving millions again to the insurance companies. This is who's coming in. When you just look at the program of some of these people who are being lauded, as this is a woman heading up the Secretary of Commerce, but where is she on the class divide? Actually slicing away pensions, cutting Medicaid, cutting all kinds of programs. And Rhode Island has the highest COVID rate per capita in the world. And she's being lauded as someone who is dealing with her state's COVID outbreak. Yes, she is doing it by actually shielding by executive order nursing homes and hospitals and healthcare, private healthcare providers from any liability, and increasing the insurance rates in the midst of a pandemic. So it's so important, both like you were saying, every day you're seeing it, and we will be experiencing it in I think terrible ways in the days ahead, because these are people with very sophisticated plans. She also, by the way, just to say, is for charter schools for profit. And here so many people thought that would go with Trump. No, it's going to be reinforced by when you look at the appointees. That's it.
Thank you, Sarah. Great additions. Does anyone else want to speak on this before we move on?
Go ahead, Nate.
Oh.
No, go.
Yeah, I think it's worth emphasizing, as Jimmy raised, that Medicare for all is not even a radical or socialist proposal. It's actually the standard in, I believe, every other country in the imperial core in the world. I mean, it's not even a socialist proposal. And even during a pandemic, it's still too much for Joe Biden. It's also a proposal with overwhelming support among the population as a whole, and among particularly really among Democratic Party voters. And so I think that goes to show how Biden and his cronies and the Democratic Party as a whole does not exist to serve the interests of the working people who make up the vast majority of its votes, because those people are very clear. They want Medicare for all. Biden serves the interests of the ruling class that is not interested in Medicare for all. So that even in this moment of the utmost crisis and suffering, a basic mild reformist policy is too much for Biden and his cronies.
Just as to had to chime in on that. Nate's point is so well taken. It's it's irrational, it's inhumane, it's obscene that in the United States, you don't even have basic health insurance based on the government, which exists in most of the big imperialist countries and many developing countries. But the other historical question for leftists, for revolutionaries, for Marxists, for the working class, that the question begs is what's going to come up? It's already coming up, and that is a comparison between Biden and FDR, the president of during the New Deal and the worker struggles of the 30s. I'm not going to try to say too much about that. We might, matter of fact, my guess is at some point we'll probably have a webinar about that, because I think it may become an important political issue. I mean, just how that comparison plays out may be a little bit premature. We have to sort of wade into the Biden administration a little bit more, but I'll make this point about it. Many leftists still arguing about it. Actually, Roosevelt, who somewhat unlike Biden, was born into a ruling class family, was not progressive at all, was an imperialist, a ruling class politician, until the upsurge of the working class scared the hell out of him. And he told J.P. Morgan and all the other imperialists that if they didn't make concessions to workers, that that will be like the Soviet Union. So that's what he did. He was trying to save capitalism, but it draws the crisis into some sharp relief, because we are facing the existential crisis of capitalism. And as we get further into the struggle, while we need to be fighting for every reform that brings even a little aid to workers who are suffering, from the point of view of healthcare, from the point of view of COVID relief, from the point of view of what happens to the jobless, from the point of view of fighting white supremacy and racism, and housing and against evictions. We have to be that. If you're not in that struggle, you're going to be separate from the working class, and you'll be abstract and somewhat intellectual in a bad way. On the other hand, our objective this time, as distinct from many of the forces in the movement 80 years ago, more than that now, 80, 90 years ago, the height of the 30s, is not merely to reform a decrepit, decaying, dying world system of which the US, the belly of the beast is at the center of. Our objective is to do away with that system. So our long term, which is getting pretty short term, is not to do anything to revive this hellish system, but to replace it with a revolutionary socialist society. And soon, we believe it will become clearer and clearer to most that in fact is the choice.
If I have a very short point. I know this is going on and on. Every time I hear Medicare for all, I mean, we used to talk about universal health care. There used to be a demand for universal health care, which was free health care. Medicare means you pay the government. I mean, I pay the government every month for my Medicare. Plus, then I got to buy another insurance policy because it doesn't cover enough. So Medicare for all is so not adequate. And the fact that he won't even support that means he's really in the pocket of not only the insurance companies, but the pharmaceutical companies who are among the, some of the biggest members of the ruling class in this country. But what I did want to say is that, COVID is it's sort of like the epicenter of the pandemic has moved west. And it's really in LA, and it's really in the most oppressed sector of LA, East LA. And there have been, like there was in New York at the beginning of the pandemic, nursing and doctor shortages. So they've been making or forcing the healthcare staff to work longer hours to take on more patients, and the nurses are contracting COVID at alarming rates and are doing work stoppages and trying to reach out and get people to support their effort. Because when you increase, when you increase the staffing numbers, the number of patients that they need to take care of, you endanger not only the patients, but you endanger the nurses. And it's just back to the same old, they don't have enough PPE. And then I just wanted to end by just saying, one of the things about, Joe Biden, his record is so out there for people to see in terms of the way he treated incarcerated people, the way he's done so many different things. Kamala Harris's, you have to dig a little bit more. But as state attorney general, besides the fact that she didn't really put herself out on the cutting edge, she made some really bad decisions. And one of the decisions was when her office denied a transgender prisoner the right to a gender surgery. So, and this was while she was attorney general in California, living in San Francisco, where you have such a vibrant LGBTQ plus community. So we have a lot of things we need to work on. Besides the fact that incarcerated people have no access to healthcare anyway. But this was actually a lawsuit, and Kamala Harris came down on the wrong side.
Thank you, Judy. Okay, I'm going to move right on here. We are happy to announce that we have resumed printing hard copies of Workers' World newspaper again on a monthly basis after temporarily suspending hard copy production due to the COVID-19 pandemic. You can also subscribe to receive Workers' World newspaper by email at workers.org. And you can also post your questions in the Q&A or in the comments on Facebook, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. We see major crises like the January 6th insurgency at the U.S. Capitol as ways for the state to massively increase its repressive apparatus. In the 90s, Biden co-wrote the Omnibus Counterterrorism Act, which in many ways laid the groundwork for the U.S. Patriot Act and stripped citizens of a wide range of fundamental civil liberties. After 9/11, Biden voted for the USA Patriot Act, which was an all-out assault on civil liberties. He has supported increasing funding for police after the BLM uprising. Now Biden is talking about a domestic anti-terrorism law. Nate, can you talk to us about how this is going to impact the working class?
Thanks, Ezra. Absolutely. So I think the first thing for us to understand is that anytime the repressive apparatus of the state, the cops, the military, the courts, the jails are expanded, whatever the reason and justification for it, the ultimate target at which those forces are directed are working and oppressed people here and abroad, and in particular, the most oppressed sections of our class: Black people, Indigenous people, trans people, undocumented migrants, disabled people. And so when we hear Biden talk about the need to place an emphasis on domestic terrorism to deal with the threat of far-right forces, we should understand that whatever policies are put forward, whatever measures are taken or laws passed in that name, they will ultimately be directed not towards the far right, but towards the left and towards working and oppressed people. We see already that the January 6th far-right demonstration at the Capitol, and I really make a point not to call it a storming of a Capitol, because you don't storm a building that you are allowed into. And the collaboration between the police, their token resistance to the right wing, really reveals how, going back to what Larry and Sarah were saying earlier, they're both on the same side of that barricade, and we're on the other side, folks. The working and oppressed are on the other side of that barricade. So we're already seeing that what happened on January 6th is being blamed on calls this summer in the aftermath of the uprising in response to the police lynching of George Floyd to defund the police. That what happened at the Capitol is the result of people calling for the police to be defunded. Now, that's pretty incredible First of all, because the police were not actually defunded. There have been no substantial decreases in the police and police budgets over the past few months, and many have been expanded, which Biden and even his supporter Bernie Sanders have advocated for. So we're seeing that despite no basis in reality, the left is being blamed for what happened at the Capitol. And ultimately, working and oppressed people, as well as socialist revolutionaries and other revolutionary left progressive forces, will be the target of any sort of domestic terror legislation. And I think it's important to clarify that we've already seen, and we're going to see more in the coming days, of charges against and arrests of far-right participants in what happened at the Capitol. And I'll be the first to admit that I don't shed a single tear for those right-wingers when I see them arrested, or I really don't mind it at all, I'll admit. But I have no illusions that those police and state forces are ultimately going to resolve the problem of the far right. And that's because, again, the far right and the state are on the same side of the global class war. And so whatever contradictions exist between them are very much secondary to their unity against working and oppressed people here and abroad, and in particular, the most oppressed sections. I think it's worth mentioning that, for example, Senator Mark Warner from the Intelligence Committee, when talking about the need to push back against far-right white supremacist groups, also felt the need to mention, don't forget about Antifa. Those Antifa folks, we got to be looking at them too. And so already, again, no legislation has been passed, no policies have been put into effect, and already the conversation is being set up to include and ultimately shift the target of the national security state from the far right to working and oppressed people. For example, Black liberation activists in New Jersey being visited by the FBI to be asked for information about January 6th. Now, why would people fighting for Black liberation have any information about a white supremacist demonstration? Obviously, it's just an excuse for FBI intimidation of Black activists. And we're going to see more and more of that in the days to come. I want to point out that Senator Durbin and a number of others, a bipartisan group, have put forward this Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, which calls for domestic terrorism units to be created in the DHS, FBI, and DOJ. Now, given the white supremacist history since the founding of this country of those kinds of institutions, why should we expect them to lead an effective response against the far right? Giving them more resources, creating more units is going to ultimately, again, forgive me for sounding like a broken clock, be directed towards working and oppressed people and the left. And we see that in the aftermath of the Patriot Act, of which Biden played a role, with not only above all, the massive racist surveillance of Muslim communities and Muslim organizations in the US and their infiltration by the state apparatus. We see it in the arrest of anti-war activists by the FBI in 2010 across the country. And furthermore, we have to see that many of the people who are putting on Klan hoods or streaming themselves walking into the Capitol are going back to their day jobs as police officers. And I think about 20% of the participants in the Capitol so far identified are ex-military, not to mention the enormous number that are business people of both petty and decidedly not petty varieties. So I think the lesson that we have to draw from this, the two lessons, are that one, every expansion of the state the repressive state will ultimately be targeted towards working and oppressed people and the left. And that furthermore, both the far right and the more milquetoast, respectable, and larger faction of the working class represented by Joe Biden can only be pushed back by the independent, organized struggle of working and oppressed people. And we cannot rely on the ruling class to advocate for or carry forward the struggles of working and oppressed people here or abroad. Thanks, everybody.
I have to say this, those are some right on points. All occupations are not equal. If workers occupy something to get better wages, to get the right to organize, to further the interests of the working class, we don't look at that as the same way one would look at these white supremacists and fascists occupying the Capitol with the help of many police. So this is not they don't equal these things. Also, you're going to hear a lot about the second impeachment of Trump. And I think a lot of progressive people will be sympathetic to that idea for understandable reasons. But make no mistake, this second impeachment of Trump is mostly a struggle within the ruling class. And it may even be a distraction. I mean, what about impeaching evictions and impeaching attacks on the working class and impeaching white supremacy and impeaching all of the things that we face, impeaching capitalism? So I don't think we should be too caught up in that. Could be a diversion. This capitalist government, the White House and the Congress should be forced to concentrate on the demands of the workers, particularly Black and brown workers who are suffering. And all of their inter-ruling class rivalry, that can wait.
Thank you, Larry.
Sure.
That was a great point. Does anyone else want to speak on this?
Yeah, thank you, really, Nate, for raising this, because it's a real challenge question for every organization whenever there is increased police, FBI surveillance as to how to handle it. And under an investigation of the extreme right, which was, I couldn't agree more, allowed to happen, all but walk in the door. The Capitol Police did nothing. It's not even inept. There's a great deal of intent. But now that they're being ordered to go after these fascist forces, what are they doing instead? And there was recently a statement put out referring to FBI visits by the Durham Beyond Policing, talking about FBI visits to progressive and Black Lives Matter movement folks in 6 states. It's not only the visit to the new Black Panther Party, but to activists across the US to question them supposedly about January 6th. When you first hear it, it seems so impossible, so ludicrous. And yet it's part of the intent of intimidating new and younger activists. And in an earlier time, there were training sessions how to handle when the FBI knocks, when police agencies interfere. We need to do this again, because very often it is against people who are green card holders, it's against Muslims, it's against young activists on their job and to their parents and to their homes. And so even to the simple answer to say, speak to my lawyer, I have nothing to say, is important training that has to be reinforced. And we're reinforcing it in our own organization. Groups across the country are taking down the Know Your Rights that the Center for Constitutional Rights made, should be hanging in offices. People need to know this, to know how to respond to an intrusive police visit, and that there's nothing to be gained in answering anything in any way whatsoever. Even a small misanswer to a federal agent is considered a felony. So better not to answer, always, and simply say, speak to my lawyer. And then alert the movement, alert us, alert, because obviously nobody has their own private lawyer except for the millionaires, except for the very rich. We don't have private lawyers, but we'll make sure that no one faces FBI or police units alone. That's what backup is for, and that's why you build organizations where you're not isolated. But that will be increasing, I think, right now. They use the opportunity. They don't want to go after the right. They're totally infected with, saturated with the right. They want to go after the movement for change. So we have to know how to defend ourselves.
Thank you, Sarah. Anyone else before we move on?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Judy.
Okay, thanks. Now, thank you, Sarah, and very much. And thank you, Nate, for really a very thorough report. But I just wanted to mention something. It's like when we were out demanding an end to the Muslim ban, which may be coming to a close with the executive order, at least as it was written. We also talked about the wall. We said, no walls, no ban. And it's interesting, when I was researching the wall was actually Bill Clinton is the president that funded the beginning of the building of the wall. So, and in fact, all of the bills to finance the wall after Bill Clinton's efforts in the 90s to start the wall, which started small, it was only in a couple of cities facing Mexico. It was always bipartisan support. There was never a question that it was the Democrats and the Republicans were both for and at one point, one of the bills had to do with, well, we'll build less of a wall, but we'll build a wall, but we'll deter people from, we'll make it harder for people to go through, like the desert, which is where a lot of deaths have occurred. So the Democrats were totally complicit with the incredible deaths, really the genocide against migrants trying to cross over to the United States. But the other thing that I just wanted to mention about the anti-terrorism bill, which Biden helped write, the 1996 anti-terrorism bill, is that, and it has to do with what they throw into bills, of course, is that there were two items which had nothing to do with, quote unquote, fighting terrorism. And one was it really slashed the ability of prisoners to do habeas corpus, prisoners on death row, to do habeas corpus appeals. It really minimized their chance of fighting for their lives under the death penalty, the federal death penalty, which has affected a lot of people, including Mumia Abu Jamal when he was working on his appeals, and other people on death row. But it also the door for what is still happening today, which is when undocumented incarcerated workers get out, if they have a quote unquote, if they have a rap sheet, if they had a crime, and their crime could be crossing the border illegally without papers, they are immediately deported without any appeals whatsoever. They're just swooped up. So they've done their time, which was probably, an illegal, not for anything that they did wrong to begin with. And then they're swooped up and they're returned to either at the border or to their home country. But I just raise that because that's what they do. They take these bills, which are already heinous and right wing, and they stuff more things in it that are harmful to our class. And that's another thing to look at this domestic terrorism bill. Who knows what is going to be actually covered by it?
Thank you, Judy.
Can I just
Anyone
wrap up
else?
real quick?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to go off something Sarah raised. Thank you, Sarah, for talking about what to do if the state or the FBI comes to talk to you. And again, the answer is, I have nothing to say, speak to my lawyer, take a card. The answer is not, I don't know anything or I'm not involved with that. The answer is, I have nothing to say. That's the answer that protects you and protects everyone else. To that end, I think it's important to say that right now, the safest place, if you are an activist, the safest place to be from state repression is in an organization. Very often, the FBI wants to intimidate people out of joining organizations. But the reason they want to do that is because people are stronger and safer when they're in an organization, because then you have a network of people and experiences to protect you if you are subject to that kind of surveillance or harassment. And so now more than ever, and I know Ezra talked about it earlier, now more than ever is the time to join an organization. And I will confess to have a certain bias to one in particular. Lastly, I just want to say, going back to something Larry raised at the very beginning about the growing struggle in the workplace right now and its significance. 1,400 workers at the largest food distribution center in the country are on strike right now at the Hunts Point Market in the East Bronx, where a very large portion of the food that's imported into the United States comes in and is then distributed around the country. And, they face really serious police repression just shortly before Biden's inauguration. And those cops didn't need to know who was in the White House to know that it was their job to break that picket line. They didn't need to know that. It was they had the same job, and their job was to break that picket line. And so, some of us I know are going to be, we've been in touch with the workers and organizers there and are be sending up delegations to support that strike. But I think that's pretty incredible to see 1,400 workers on strike because their bosses won't give them $1 raise during a pandemic when they're responsible for feeding a good portion of the entire country. Shows that, the struggle of working and oppressed people is on the up and up. So thanks.
Thank you, Nate. I'm going to move right along.
I didn't hear Biden say anything about that or try to stop it. I must have missed it.
So this is the final question that we're going to have for tonight because we're getting close to time. We have talked tonight about the inability of the Biden administration and really the entire capitalist class to signify change, the life and death issues faced by working class people. Who can make a difference, and how can we help make these revolutionary changes happen? Anyone can answer this question.
Yeah, I think I can just take a stab at bringing my 2 cents into the wrap up. I just wanted to make a point as to the Biden administration and Democrats as a whole. I feel that going forward, the Democrats and the so-called resistance squad might be, very, very eager to sort of demonize and criminalize poverty. Because you see that you have seen that in their demonization of the Trump base. And they have tended to demonize Trump and his supporters as kind of, rednecks, kind of, trailer park, I don't know if I can say the word, but hicks. And I feel that for a lot of the working class Trump supporters, I feel that a lot of them have a reputation for being, fascist or for being racist or for being bigots. But to me, I feel that a large part of Trump's fan base, especially those that voted for him in 2016, didn't really vote for him because because they were racist or because they were bigots. They voted for Trump because I think they were disillusioned by what the two-party system was offering them. Because as the 90s wore on and as the 2000s wore on, it became both the Democratic and the Republican Party both became the party of elitists, both became the party that represented the interests of the bourgeoisie, and it did not represent the interests of the workers. It did not represent the interests of the proletariat. So as time wore on, I feel that a lot of working class people in the working class, even in the white working class, were kind of disillusioned by both Democrats and Republicans, and they weren't really willing to even vote for a lot of the status quo Republicans. They were really looking for something different. They were looking for something fresh. They were looking for something that really rebelled against the system and really bucked the Washington, status quo. And unfortunately, a lot of them found that in Trump. And more to the point, a lot of Trump supporters might have been Bernie Sanders supporters, and they were kind of frustrated. Well, it's not really like a big majority of them, but a small minority of Trump supporters were actually Bernie supporters who were frustrated, and they saw what Hillary Clinton and the Democratic base did to Bernie Sanders. And granted, Bernie Sanders isn't really the most radical revolutionary as it is, but if they were able to sabotage Bernie Sanders' interests, Bernie Sanders' chances at the Democratic nomination, they realized that the Democrats didn't really serve their interests. So they kind of moved onwards to Trump because they felt that Trump represented something different. Even if he really didn't ultimately serve their interests, but at least he kind of like called it as he saw it, and then they felt that that transparency was missing in politics. And I feel that many of them are kind of starting to see the errors in their ways. They're starting to see Trump for who he really is. And a lot of these Trump supporters or former Trump supporters actually voted for Biden in the 2020 election. And I feel that rather than trying to demonize them or try to throw them under the bus, it's potentially important to really build common ground with a lot of them, because a lot of these working class voters or working class people aren't really outright vicious fascists or bigots. They're just feel let down by politics. And I feel like it's very important to really find solidarity and common ground with them and really bring them over to our camp going forward.
I think that's a very important point that Jimmy made. For a lot of leftists who really need to understand the complexities and different sectors of the working class, I think this tendency that Jimmy described, why would some workers, be supportive of, a monster like Trump? I think that problem is more dangerous when there is no big, strong, gravitational, united working class fight back. Then, a lot of people are left with the bourgeois alternatives. So we shouldn't be surprised if, some make, mistakes and then learn later. But just on the, capping the discussion with the question that the comrade posed, I would argue that the main task of the best leftists, the best revolutionaries at this time would be concentrating on organizing the working class. The left can be very good at symbolic protests, which are very necessary sometimes. We are weaker at base building in the working class. And the base building is a bridge that this crisis is going to force us to cross. A bridge to a new workers' movement that's inclusive, especially of the most oppressed. A bridge to a new workers' movement that is more internationalist, that sees itself and acts like a worldwide class. A bridge to a movement that makes the struggle against white supremacy and racism central. A bridge to a movement that's more anti-capitalist, a working class movement that's more anti-capitalist and for socialism. Now is the time, I think, more than any time, because of the conditions, because of what's at stake, and also because there are a lot of revolutionaries of all generations, but perhaps mostly young revolutionaries. Now's the time to begin in a very revolutionary way, helping the transformation of the working class movement. This means a lot of things. This means for those leaders in the organized labor movement that are class collaboration, that are tied to the Democratic Party, that are for capitalism. We got to push them out so that our class can be free to rise up against capitalism and be independent of the capitalist parties. And so what young radicals, many of whom were in the streets in recent months, what they're thinking, how they're processing events, and whether they get some of what I'm saying, perhaps someone else can say it better, I think is going to be very decisive. And will some of them direct themselves to transforming the working class and commit themselves to helping to lead this transformation?
Thank you, Larry. Who'd like to go next?
Nate, just talk. You got your
Okay.
hand up. I
Sorry.
see you.
Oh, sorry, Nate.
Just
Yeah,
talk.
yeah. Sorry about that. Just a few things. I mean, I think first of all, to what Jimmy had raised, this is an example of what happens when there is a vacuum. When there is a vacuum, when people see that the neoliberal consensus has no answers for them, they're going to go for just about any other answer. And so in the absence of a real left pole to win people, people are going to be attracted to a right pole if it comes forward. Now, it may not be, in fact, it usually isn't the same people. It's really a question of how much people are inspired or mobilized or organized, that in the absence of a left pole, that those who are susceptible to being won to the right are going to be won to it more easily. And we've talked about this on previous webinars, how the base of the far right is the petty bourgeoisie. It's the small business owners, the self-employed, but this lack of a left pole allows the far right to grab the most reactionary sections of the working class, or potentially reactionary white sections of the working class, and pull them away from their class. And this has been, a huge problem in the United States and in the entire 20th and 21st century as to why we haven't had more Marxist revolutions in the imperial cores. Lastly, I want to say that in terms of what we need to do going forward, there has to be an emphasis, as Larry said, on organizing working and oppressed people into organizations, whether those be revolutionary parties, mass organizations, tenant organizations, unions, whatever. We got to get people in organizations. And there's a lot of anti-communist propaganda that is put out there, even among the left by the ruling class, that says organization is bad. But the history of the struggle of working and oppressed people shows nothing more clearly than the necessity of organization. And we've seen, for example, this past summer, the extraordinary influence of the spontaneous uprising of millions of working and oppressed people, particularly the most oppressed sections of our class, like the Black community. We have also seen the limitations of what that can accomplish and the degree to which that movement can resist co-optation by the ruling class without a large, powerful influence of organized left forces. And so now is the time that if we want to go further than we have, if we want to push the struggle forward, we must organize working and oppressed people and win working and oppressed people to the idea that we must be organized under the leadership of the most oppressed sections of our class if we are to carry our struggle forward to revolutionary victory. Thank you.
And I would just add, if you don't mind, just add something really, I'm getting feedback here, but something that I think is really important, that a lot of us have noticed the days leading up to the election and even after the election, a real, the movement has gone silent. to a great extent, and everyone seemed to be holding their breath. And a lot of times when a Democrat is elected, yeah, there's some great executive orders, but the movement for revolutionary change receives a very heavy setback because people tend to be nicer. They want to wait. They want to give them a chance. And I'm going to say, after everything we have said tonight and everything all of us see and have seen since, even just want to say the last few months, there is no way that we can give Biden a chance. And I'm going to ask you to say, and I'm not saying we go and egg the White House, although, hey, not a bad idea. But what I'm saying is, we need to keep organizing. We need to organize our class. We need to be independent. We need not to wait to find out what his immigration program is. We need not to wait for all of these promises that are going to be coming up. We don't want to say, oh, we're going to wait 100 days. In 100 days, we should be demonstrating. We should be bringing massive numbers of people into the street, because that's going to be May Day, right? And we can't wait. People can't wait. They need relief. There's so many. We need an end to the police lynchings in the Black and Brown community. So many things need to be end to the deportations, and we cannot wait. That's what I hope that we take to heart.
I'll just add on this because it's such a good question. When you think this past summer, this powerful movement, the Black Lives Movement, in response to police murders, and the millions and millions of people who were in the streets, literally in thousands of cities. And there was a poll done at the time that was kind of staggering. I couldn't even believe it was true, but that 80% of the population was sympathetic or supportive of this movement. This is how ideas change. That meant millions of white workers were finally understanding something and moving in a different direction. Now, what happened? There were strong forces in the Democratic Party that said this movement won't help us. They tried to quiet it down, put it back in the box, put everything into the vote. Really, in many ways, it undercut this movement because the Biden victory was seen as more important. But it is what people win in the streets, in real struggles, that changes. People change in confrontations, literally, in movements that impact them, where they're forced to choose and to see where is justice, where are rights. So to see that many, there was overwhelmingly, particularly among white youth, a fundamental change. That's the kind of thing we don't want to put back in the box at all. As a matter of fact, we were encouraging, there was a resolution by a number of unions that said why we should have a general strike in support of this movement. That would have had an enormous change. They pulled back because they got too involved in the elections. That's unfortunate. But we have to look for those opportunities, because when our class moves, and particularly moves against the racism of this system, they're breaking with actually the underpinnings of the society in a way. We want them to demand absolutely Medicare for all, but it's interesting that the movement, the most powerful movement, was not for Medicare or for 15 an hour. It was for Black lives. And that is a kind of a fundamental break that can change political consciousness in other ways. So let's really look at these movements and not allow the idea that it's more reasonable to elect a Biden, that somehow we'll get it through him. It won't happen that way.
Thank you, Sarah. Does anyone else want to speak? I can just add that regardless of what the Biden administration has promised to do, that they've already gone back on, which is passing the Equality Act in the first 100 days, which would be important for the most marginalized people because it would ban things like conversion therapy, which is so rampant in this country. And it would ban all forms of discrimination on the basis of sex, gender identity, and sexual orientation as well. But there are other things we need to push as well. We can't just push for no discrimination in healthcare. We have to push for healthcare for all. And we can't just push for the LGBTQ plus prisoners to be treated fairly. We have to push for the abolition of prisons. So there are much bigger issues, of course, that we have to push for outside of this. But we also have to get out there and say, we need this legislation, because we need to protect especially Black trans women who are killed at an extremely alarming rate, and they should not have to die. And of course, there's no guarantee any of these things will be effective if they are implemented, but just having a basis of protection for people who are so marginalized and who are so violently attacked would be everything. Does anyone else have anything to say?
I just had this small thing. The need for revolutionaries to draw clear class interest distinctions. And I think that was a big part of the heavy lifting we were doing tonight in relationship to this new capitalist administration. Does not mean that we're not strategic. For example, if the Biden administration, for whatever reason, does anything that makes it even a little easier for workers to organize, I'm thinking of changes to the National Labor Relations Board or this or that, then everybody who's interested in unionizing workers or new forms of organization and different forms of organization, like one of the comrades was talking about, we should break down the door and organize like hell. In other words, we should use this. We should strategically use this if in fact it exists, hypothetically, to an end that strengthens an independent working class movement. That's it.
Thank you, Larry. If you like this conversation and you want to read more from Workers' World and our other great comrades, you can also check out our new book, What Road to Socialism. You can buy it online or download a copy for free at workers.org/books. We'd also like to ask you to donate to help us continue these webinars. Our Venmo is at Workers' World. You can donate at our website, workers.org/donate. And at our Patreon, which is patreon.com/WWP, which supports subscriptions for hundreds of incarcerated workers who get our paper for free. And of course, if you like what you hear, please consider becoming our comrade. It's very important for us to all come together in this struggle. And it's very easy to fill out the join form. And as soon as you do, an organizer will get in contact with you. So that's all we have for you tonight. Join us next week, same time, same place, and you can find more info at workers.org. Build a workers' world.
Build a workers' world.